Welcome to the Literature Lounge, where writers and authors share their stories behind their stories.
It's a great story that I stumbled upon while researching something almost entirely different. The story sort of chose me.
So, in the book, there has been the core family dispute that motivates the murder. So, what are some of the particular vices that is what actually is the murder all about?
I was looking at treatments for cholera and experiments involving cholera and plague in India in the 1920s and 30s. A small news item from 1935 about a murder, in which a brother had killed his brother with plague. That caused me to change course quite rapidly.
Hi, in today's episode, we have with us Dan Morrison, who's a tabloid crime reporter whose global writings on science, culture, and conflict have appeared in the New York Times, National Geographic, Art Forum, and The Guardian. His journalism from the US, South Asia, and Africa has been recognized by the New York Press Club, the Association of British Science Writers, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and the South Asian Journalist Association. So we are extremely honored to have him here today. But today is a topic that's very close to my heart. The Poisoner of Bengal is his second book, which uncovers a thrilling true crime story of two feuding brothers in 1930s India. None of us were born at that time. Blending history and intrigue, the tale moves through colonial estates, lavish parties, and courtrooms, offering a vivid look at the cultural tensions and dramatic change sweeping both British and Indian society. Welcome to today's episode, Dan. So let me just, for our listeners, just repeat the name of the book once again: The Poisoner of Bengal, the 1930s murder that shocked the world. So let's start with what inspired you to write this book.
It's a great story that I stumbled upon while researching something almost entirely different. I was looking at treatments for cholera and experiments involving cholera and plague in India in the 1920s and 30s, and stumbled just quite accidentally upon a small news item from 1935 about a murder, in which a brother had killed his brother with plague, and that caused me to change course quite rapidly.
And how did you come upon that news item from 1930?
I had started my first book was a book about the Nile River, and I traveled the length of the Nile River from Lake Victoria to the Mediterranean Sea, and my second book was supposed to be about the Ganges River, and I traveled the Ganga from the Meru Glacier down to the Bay of Bengal. But that book never quite came together. However, while on that journey and while researching the Ganga, I started to look at the questions of the healing factor of the Ganga, of that special quality of the water and what was behind it. And that led me into other related topics, and one of those was cholera. And so while looking for a missing manuscript of the biography of a researcher who created the first vaccines for cholera in India, I came across this murder because that man's name was Waldemar Hafkin, and the plague that was used in this murder had been procured from the Hafkin Institute in Bombay.
Amazing. So, why did you choose a crime set in colonial India, specifically the murder committed with the plague? How did you come across the entire historical case? I'm sure our listeners will be dying to know more about it.
Yeah, no, the story sort of chose me. It was a very nice combination of what was then my preoccupation then was, historical medical research, but my origins were covering crime in New York City as a newspaper reporter. And this story seemed to be a perfect marriage of both of those things. It takes place during a period of really tremendous scientific advances and new treatments for diseases that had really bedeviled humanity for centuries. And at the same time, it was just a very kind of a gnarly murder set among the Bengali aristocracy. It was hard to pass up.
Definitely. So, in the book, there has been the core family dispute that motivates the murder. So, what are some of the, particular vices that what actually is the murder all about? Tell us about that.
You know, we we've all seen these grand houses from a bygone era where one half of the house sort of gets chopped off, and an apartment block goes up, and the other half remains intact. And this is generally brothers, right? This is brothers, and they've been left a plot of land by their parents, and they can't agree on what to do with it. Um, when you extrapolate that to the zamindari class and the rural nobility, it's not one house. You're talking, hundreds or thousands of acres of land. And for this estate known as the Pakar Raj in what is now Jharkhand, you had an older brother and his younger half brother who were supposed to be co-sharers of this estate after their father died. And the elder brother wanted it all to himself, and the younger brother was ill-equipped to match him, to match his sort of, in a way, visionary elder brother who wanted it all for himself and wished to remake himself as more than just a zamindar, as to be like a modern 20th century man. He saw his future in making movies and in a sort of personal freedom that really with the strictures of that class and that social setting, he had to break free, and the way that he was going to do it was to keep all the land and all the money to himself.
So, one aspect of the story that stands out is Amarendra's murder by a biological weapon, plague, no less. So, how does this detail reflect the scientific knowledge and the darker side of innovation in that era?
So this is an era of almost breakneck innovation, from the early 1910s into the 1930s, where diseases that had just invariably been fatal were now acquiring, if not cures, treatments, right? So you see the first vaccines for cholera. A vaccine for plague is introduced in the late 1800s. Serums for tetanus. Tetanus was a death sentence once upon a time. Now it's just a routine vaccination. In this period, it was there's sort of a Wild West atmosphere of experimentation in which these germs are available to any amateur with the gumption and the curiosity and the means to figure it out. You have these sort of gentleman scientists or amateur scientists are all going at these diseases, and the controls that are common today for this sort of thing were almost completely unknown at the time, and this led to a lot of leakage, not just in India but around the world, where you have a phenomenon in the 20s known as called the germ murder, where in Europe and the United States you see lots of heirs and heiresses going down, with typhus or diphtheria or other diseases, typically because a family member or a lawyer attached to the family is trying to bump them off for the money.
You're taking names of diseases that people no longer talk about, but my mom, diphtheria and all these other diseases are gone now in India. So, can you just explain a little bit about the trial phase? The lawyers involved, the testimony involved, the media attention. What happens during the trial?
So this was the newspapers called this the trial of the century, but the century was pretty young at the time, and it was a very unusual trial. It was the longest criminal trial in British Indian history, and it had a lot of lawyers involved, because not only was Benayendra, the Raja of Pakur, charged with murder, so too were two fairly prominent Calcutta physicians and a sort of down and out doctor as well, who was the real accomplice. So you have Benayendra, you have Dr. Taranath, his sidekick, who helped culture the plague used in the murder. And then there were two other doctors who were just sort of swept in by a very zealous police investigation that went too far, and both of their reputations were very badly damaged. from this trial, to the point that when I spoke to a neighbor of one of the doctors, who was just a child at the time, she still remembered him as as a stone cold killer, when actually he was actually blameless. But um, there were it was an unusual trial in the amount of scientific evidence that was used. It was unusual by today's standards in the sense that neither the prosecution nor the defense produced their own independent experts. Instead, doctors who were just witnesses in the case were used as experts on the stand. And that would never happen today. A prosecution witness could not also be an expert for the prosecution. Like it's just not done today. It was very closely watched in the newspapers. It made headlines around the world, in New York and London and in Australia, just across the British Empire and the English speaking world. And it was also extraordinary in the sense that the defense produced not a single witness. That they were our killer was so confident in himself that he did very little to cover his tracks. And so when the plan went awry, and what went awry was that their victim died not quickly, but after nearly 8 days, and thus they were able to take a blood sample that showed he died of plague. They kind of had nowhere to run once that evidence was found. The Benayendra is caught on the Bombay Mail, hot-footing it to Bombay with a ton of money in his bags, presumably so he could buy off those witnesses and silence them. But through a stroke of luck, the police were able to learn what train he was on and arrest him. The trial takes place in a courtroom that is an armed camp, because you have a very violent insurgency taking place in Bengal, in which judges and colonial officials are being regularly shot at, and many are assassinated. It's a part of the Indian freedom movement that, at least here in my country, we don't know much about. We're pretty much raised on the story of the Gandhian movement, which was so influential. But we don't know about these violent uprisings that took place, especially in Bengal and the Punjab, and whether or not they advanced the cause of the Indian freedom movement. They were really they were significant at the time, and they were pretty hot.
Absolutely. I'm from Bengal, Dan. So, yes, we've heard of all these stories, and there were many violent uprisings, and many people lost their lives. Now, just coming back to Benayendra is the antagonist, right? So, it seems like such a complex figure. So, what was your approach, to portraying him? And did you anywhere along the way feel empathy for him while you were writing?
I mean, he's a 20th century man who almost succeeds in running circles around what are essentially the Victorian institutions of the Raj. He is about self-invention or reinvention, when his social class is about tradition and continuity. He's not interested in continuity, and that's a very modern figure. It's a very modern archetype to remake yourself. And sometimes to make an omelet you got to break a few eggs, and this is what he's doing. His inspiration in this crime is very clearly, to me, a Sherlock Holmes story called The Adventure of the Dying Detective. And a couple of years before the murder, a film adaptation of that story, made in America, appears in Indian cinemas. And he's a movie fiend. He's a cinema addict. There's testimony from his driver that every other day he was at the movies, with guests or just alone. And he wrote that his own aspiration was to be a film producer and to create films that would satisfy both sort of the Hindu heartland, the traditionalist, populations, and also sort of the more the Bengali urban, more sophisticated audiences. He'd really put some thought into this. So he's an interesting cat. A a young jailer who befriends him when he's in the Alipur jail. This young jailer goes on to become, a well-known prison administrator and author in Bengal, and he writes that of all of the convicts he had seen, that Benoyendra was both this sort of figure of beauty and nobility, and also at the same time one of the few true criminals that he'd ever encountered.
So let's talk a little bit about your research. You sifted through extensive trial records and archives. So can you just share what was the process like, and if you encountered any unexpected discoveries along the way? Did you spend a lot of time in libraries in India? Did you do that?
I did. The whole case was unexpected to me, and the details of it, as you'll see in the book, are really quite astounding. The the main piece of research took place in London because the entire trial record was in the British Library, and so what I had started doing, a decade ago, was whenever I passed through London, stealing literally just hours at a time to try to photograph a few pages of this voluminous record, just to try to get a handle on what had happened, and then eventually I got the whole thing. Um, the There was significant research in the Indian Library in Calcutta, in the Bihar archives in Patna, and in a number of sort of private archives that are these sort of community reading rooms that used to just sort of be all over India. Every other neighborhood would have one of these reading rooms endowed by just a local worthy, with books and newspapers, and a few still remain in different states of repair, where I could find old newspapers and books and things like that really helped advance it. There's a there's a paucity of Indian newspapers and magazines from that era that both have survived storage in sort of the humid conditions of the subcontinent, and very, very few have been digitized. So if you want them, you got to go find them. That's the answer.
That sounds like a lot of work. So your book also touches on the Indian independence movement. So how did this political landscape shape the court case and the way people reacted to it?
So it's India is at a simmer, and it's nearing a boil. You have the sort of the second wave of the civil disobedience movement is going on, where it's tens of thousands of nonviolent demonstrators are in prison. I think official records show. I'm making this number up because I can't remember. Records show 1,000 of these were whipped in jail during this period. These are nonviolent protesters. The tensions are extremely high between the colonial administration and the sort of middle class population. There's tensions between Gandhi and more traditionalists. There's a lot of heat, and it the judge in the case seems to have had his thumb on the scale. That even though these men were unquestionably guilty, he really wanted to be sure that the jury, there was a 6-man jury, would really find them guilty, and so he influences the case to some degree, and I think part of that comes down to the need to make sure there was a guilty verdict, because if these two men were acquitted, it would be a real blow to the colonial prestige at a time when its legitimacy was very much in question among the Indian population.
So, let's just go back into the historical case, and let's come back to the current theme in India today on wealth, power, and even today's social issues. So, do you see a connect even now?
So the the 30s are a period where sort of you have a population in India that has disposable income for the first time, and there's a lot of writing around this period of a lot of hand wringing about consumerism and about people buying cars on credit and things like that. Um, and that's a theme sort of all over the world, which is that once people get the consumerism bug, they can't shake it. Think even now of how your grandparents lived or how my grandparents lived, which is, they lived on very little and they were really quite happy. Where, when I get that Amazon package on my porch, I somehow feel some sense of fulfillment, even if it's just the most basic item that I might be ordering. We want things, and people generally, they don't go from wanting more to wanting less. They go from wanting more to wanting even more, and that's a taste of that pre-war era. That it's an India that doesn't know what's coming. Right, a world war is coming. Very deadly riots are coming, in which neighbors are going to be, acting with terrible violence upon neighbors, and then partition is coming. Right, that this is sort of a calm before that storm, and there's a lot of concern among traditionalists over changes. The movies are a part of that. The theater is a part of that, and consumerism is a big part of that.
So, what impact do you hope that this book will have on readers, both in terms of understanding historical India and in appreciating this true crime story?
I mean, first and foremost, it's just a cracking good. It's a cracking good story. It was good enough for me to devote, an enormous amount of time, digging into it. I never regretted it. I just kept learning. Um, the characters are great. The era is great. It's relatively untrammeled. Like we know about partition, we know about the freedom movement, but this is sort of somewhere in between those. In researching that and in conveying that to readers, the book also serves as sort of a small social or cultural history of that era. It's a fascinating time. That's what I would say. It's modern. It's recognizable, and it's 100 years ago, and yet so much of it is recognizable, even when so much of it is sort of alien to a modern reader.
Could you share a bit about your experience with India, both past and present, and what fascinates you the most about this absolutely wonderful country called Bharat?
So I made my first visit to India, I believe, in the summer of 1990 or 1991, shortly after Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. And I've been coming back, ever since. I've lived in Mumbai, in Delhi, in Chennai. I've traveled, up and down the country. Whether it's flying on a nice airline or traveling sleeper class. I've done it all, and I recommend it to anyone. I tell people, if you go for a week, 3 weeks, or 3 months, or a year, any portion you can take, a person should take it. There's no end to the fascination of that great country, and just a really terrific history.
Yes, truly it does. So, do you have any advice for young writers, especially those interested in true crime or historical nonfiction? What would you like to tell them?
You got to get your hands dirty. You've got to you've got to find those sources, and they're not going to be online. Like if you want to write something new, you're not going to find those sources on the internet. You're going to have to find old documents. You're going to have to, if you don't know the languages yourself, and there are a lot of languages in India, and the writing and the script of the ages changes over time. You got to find someone who knows that, who can help you. And you've got to dig for anyone who's left alive, because when you get to 100 years ago, it's really quite difficult. That's what I would say. That it will always be rewarding. There's some Sufi saying that no effort is wasted. Whether or not you come back with what you thought you were going to come back with, you'll still come out with treasure of some kind.
Absolutely. You come back a changed person. So, what's next for you, Dan? Any projects in the horizon that you would like to share with our listeners?
I'm looking at a piece involving um, international sex trafficking in the 1920s. It's a big project, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of slice I can take of it to make it digestible and enjoyable for what is, kind of a dark topic. And we'll see we'll see if it succeeds or not.
We wish you all the best, Dan, and thank you for taking out the time to be on my podcast today. And for all our listeners, the book is called The Poisoner of Bengal, the 1930s Murder That Shocked the World. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you for having me.